Three chilling accounts carry us from the trails of Redwood National Park, where a hunter stumbles on a skull unlike any other, to the mist-drenched falls of Sequoia, where a lone camper comes face to face with a towering shadow beneath the trees. And finally, high in Yosemite's Granite Domain, an unsuspecting traveler records a series of bone-rattling screams that defy earthly explanation. Each story is a puzzle piece in a larger mystery, a reminder that even in our most revered landscapes, the line between the known and the unknown can vanish beneath the twilight. Welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and become part of our ever-growing community of the curious. Now prepare yourself, because what you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. I'm not the easiest person to rattle, but I have to get this off my chest because I've been turning it over and over in my head for the last few weeks. You can call me Lou, though that's not my real name. I'm from Crescent City, and I practically grew up roaming the Redwood National Park region. My dad taught me how to track deer there when I was barely big enough to hold a rifle. I usually hunt for black-tailed deer or the occasional feral pig around the northern part of the park, in that border area close to where the Klamath River meets the ocean. Beautiful country. My father used to tell me stories of the local Yurok tribe and their beliefs about forest spirits. As a kid, I thought those were just colorful legends. But after what I found, let's just say I'm now more open to the idea that there might be forces in those trees that don't belong in the everyday world. A few months ago, late autumn around the third week of October, I was hunting alone near an old logging road that locals refer to simply as the Broken Spur. It's not on most maps anymore, but if you're from the area, you know where it is. Weather was changing that day, thick fog rolling in off the coast, the kind that clings to your jacket and makes you wonder if you're not alone. I remember checking my phone. 5:47 p.m. But it felt way later because the sun was dropping behind the tall stands of evergreens. That's when I found the remains. At first, I noticed what looked like several large bones scattered along a hidden ravine, maybe 15 feet below that old path. Now I'm not squeamish. I've dressed out deer. I've even cleared out the occasional predator from farmland in my youth, so bones don't usually make me nervous. But these bones, there was something different about them. The skull in particular, bigger than a human, but shaped strangely. I've seen bear skulls, mountain lion skulls, elk, deer, you name it. And I can tell you, from the slope of the forehead to the eye socket shape, it wasn't any of those. It almost resembled a gorilla's skull, but not quite. We don't have gorillas wandering Redwood National Park, so I don't know what the heck I was looking at. Let me pause here to say I nearly talked myself out of going down to inspect it more closely. It's not the easiest or safest thing, sliding down to a narrow ravine with a loaded rifle slung over your shoulder. But my curiosity got the better of me. The air down there was stifling, even in the open. I recall how my entire body felt colder as I approached the remains. Now maybe it was just my nerves, but it seemed as though a quiet fell over the forest. The only sound was my pulse hammering in my ears. Looking closer, the skull was bigger than a man's head by a good margin. I'd guess at least a quarter or half bigger in volume. The jawline was wide, the teeth looked a bit more like ours than a bear's or a cat's, and the eye sockets, they seemed forward-facing, not on the sides. My first wild thought was, this might be that mythical Bigfoot everyone around here whispers about. But that's not something you just say out loud to yourself. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Then I realized that under the decaying leaves and half buried in the dirt, there appeared to be more scattered remains. Ribs, vertebrae, something that might have been a broken femur. There were signs that something had rummaged through them. Possibly scavengers, coyotes, or maybe a black bear. But the weird part was the arrangement. Some bones looked intentionally piled as though someone had been messing with them or collecting them. I was so fixated on trying to figure out the shape that I didn't notice how the wind had picked up. By the time I did, I also realized it was going to get dark in a hurry. And I started feeling this intense pressure, that sensation you get in a place you're not supposed to be in. Reminded me of the time as a teenager when I stumbled onto an abandoned campsite people said belonged to some weird cult. There was just that intangible heaviness in the air. I decided to take a few pictures, but my phone was almost dead and refused to capture anything clearly in the dim light. The flash made everything look washed out, and my hands were shaking so bad I doubt I could have gotten a steady shot anyway. This is the part that might sound unbelievable. About 10 yards away from that skull, I saw an old set of footprints in the soft ground, bigger than any shoe size I've encountered, and definitely bigger than mine. I wear a size 12. The prints looked old, but they were still visible enough to notice 5 distinct toes, so if these belonged to a person, they'd have to be extremely tall and broad. If they belonged to a bear, well, it sure didn't match a typical bear track. The stride between footprints was a bit too wide as well. As I was about to make my way back up, I recall hearing a muffled snapping sound in the brush. You know that feeling when your stomach sinks and you get hyper-aware of every little movement? My peripheral vision was telling me I wasn't alone. I could sense something or someone at the top of the ridge, though I couldn't see them. I didn't exactly want to wait around and find out what it was. I practically clawed my way back up, got to the path, and listened. The snapping turned into rustling, and then quiet. In that moment, every childhood ghost story about Redwood National Park came roaring back into my mind. A handful of days later, I told a buddy from Oric about what I saw. He's a local fisherman with a knack for tall tales, so I wasn't sure if he'd believe me. But in indirect words, he said he'd heard talk from a park ranger a few months earlier of unclassified remains being found deep off trail. That ranger apparently got transferred pretty quickly, which stirred up rumors. Some folks started speculating about logging company cover-ups, others whispered about government involvement. My friend said, in his own way, that Redwood National Park has always been thick with the unexplained. I'd intended to go back, but I couldn't find the exact spot on subsequent trips. The forest can be like that, shifting, changing, especially in the heavier rainfall months. One day, you swear you know a route by heart, and the next, it's like the trail vanished or the landscape rearranged itself. I even asked around with a few folks I trust, another friend who hunts, a retired ranger living near Klamath. Some of them mentioned hearing distant howls at night. Others talked about seeing huge, shadowy shapes moving between the redwoods at dusk. And one older fellow confided in me that he'd seen something he described as a walking bear 5 years ago, an hour's drive southeast of Crescent City. If you press them for more details, they tend to clam up, but the undertone is always the same. We're messing in territory that might not belong to us. I haven't told many people about what I discovered, partly out of fear that folks will call me crazy, and partly because I don't want to be the one who leads a stampede of thrill seekers out there. But if you happen to be trekking through Redwood National Park, keep your eyes and ears open. The official line is that we have black bears, elk, mountain lions, but they don't talk about anything else. Even so, I have this unshakable feeling there's something out in those woods. And if you come across it, or if it comes across you, well, let's just say you might get more than you bargained for. Stay safe and be careful. Sometimes the forest hides secrets it would rather keep buried. Picture yourself venturing beneath the towering sequoias of California, lulled by the rush of a waterfall that sparkles in the moonlight. A camper, armed with little more than a tent, a sense of adventure, and an appetite for solitude, soon finds that something else stirs in those woods. And once you've heard their story, you might think twice before pitching your tent too far from the trail. I've been debating all morning about sending this in, but if I don't get it out there, I'm never going to sleep again. My name's Keith. Coincidental, I know, and I'm a pretty avid camper. I've spent years exploring different parts of California, always drawn to the rugged beauty of our national parks. Sequoia National Park in particular has a special place in my heart, so when I got a chance to head up there in early June, I jumped on it. I arrived on a Saturday afternoon at the Lodgepole Campground, snagged one of the last available sites, and immediately set off for a short hike toward Tokopah Falls. Some folks say it's among the most scenic waterfalls in that corner of the park. The path was still damp from late spring snowmelt, and the air was crisp, scented with pine and that unique wet earth smell you only get in mountainous areas. The plan was to do a little day hike, then come back to camp before dark and maybe roast a couple of hot dogs or something. Just me, the stars, and the comforting roar of the nearby Marble Fork of the Kaweah River. I ended up staying a bit too late at the falls, mostly because I lost track of time trying to photograph the rainbows forming in the mist. By the time I started heading back, the sun was sinking behind those colossal sequoias. The forest feels different at dusk, especially among those giant trees, like you've stepped into an ancient cathedral with no one else around. Except I realized I wasn't alone when I heard a very distinct crack of a branch not far off trail. I remember stopping short and thinking maybe it was just a bear. But the next noise sounded more like something heavy exhaling, almost a low grunt or moan. And I quickly thought, that's not a bear I'm used to hearing. I tried to ignore it, picking up my pace. When I reached my campsite, everything looked normal at first. My tent was undisturbed, my small cooler still latched, but a sense of unease clung to me. There was this thick, tense quiet in the area, as if everything else in the woods had decided to stop making a sound. I figured I was just spooked from that weird noise, so I tried to calm down, lit a small fire, and heated up some dinner. Later that night, had to be around 10:30 or 11, I was lying in my tent, listening to the constant rush of water in the distance. At some point, I dozed off. Out of nowhere, I was awakened by what I can only describe as deep, guttural breathing right outside the tent. Not a snort like a deer or the huff of a bear. It sounded more purposeful, like something that wanted me to know it was there. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might burst. I dared not even unzip the tent because the fear that washed over me was paralyzing. I could see, through the thin fabric, a tall shadow cast by my dying fire. The silhouette looked massive, towering. I must have laid there for minutes, but it felt like forever. I kept expecting this thing to move along, but it just stood there, occasionally shifting its weight. Then I noticed the faint smell, something foul, like wet fur and decaying vegetation. If you've ever been to a farm with old, stale hay, it was a bit like that, but more pungent. My mind started racing. I'd heard stories of Bigfoot sightings in these parts, but always dismissed them as nonsense or tall tales for tourists. And yet here I was, lying inches from something that definitely wasn't your average black bear. I remembered hearing about local rumors. Some folks in the nearby town of Three Rivers talk about strange sightings near the Kaweah River corridor, especially in years with heavier rainfall. I guess they figure the thick underbrush and plentiful water might draw in all sorts of wildlife. But I also recalled reading an old story in a visitor center pamphlet that mentioned a large, bipedal creature spotted decades ago around this same area. The ranger on duty brushed it off as a local legend, focusing instead on safety tips for bears and rattlesnakes. Eventually, I heard this creature shuffle around the campsite, knocking something over, possibly my little camp chair or the fire ring grate. Then there was a peculiar, quiet grunt again, and suddenly the sound of heavy footsteps moving toward the undergrowth. I stayed frozen, trying to will my heart to slow down. I don't know exactly how long I waited, but after a while, I found the nerve to peer outside. My small fire had gone down to embers, the moonlight illuminating the trees just enough to see vague shapes. Nothing. Silence except for the waterfall in the distance. I barely slept that night, so come morning, I stepped out of the tent to look around. The camp chair was definitely flipped, and the back of it had a strange smear, kind of like a muddy handprint, only bigger than my own. My pack was still in place, but the side pocket was open, like it had been rummaged through. The ground was too rocky for clear footprints, but there were some deep impressions near a damp patch of soil behind my tent. Each impression looked somewhat elongated, not like a typical bear paw. I had to gather myself because seeing that made all the fear from the night before come rushing back. I packed up fast. On my way out, I passed another camper, an older man in a green flannel who'd been up since daybreak. Indirectly, he mentioned hearing strange cries during the night, figuring it might be a wildcat or coyote. I just nodded, not sure I wanted to talk about the possibility that we had something else creeping through the campground. And the weird part is, after I got back home, I learned from a coworker who grew up near Visalia that there have been covered-up sightings of a massive bipedal figure around that general region for years. People are scared to say much because they don't want the park to become overrun with thrill seekers or ridiculed by skeptics. I'm telling this story because I want folks to know I genuinely believe there's something out there. Whatever I heard and saw that night was beyond anything I'd experienced in all my years of camping, almost like it was sizing me up or studying the campsite. If anyone else out there has had a similar encounter in Sequoia National Park, I'd really like to know I'm not alone. The granite giants of Yosemite, their ancient faces towering above the valley floor, a place where millions come seeking nature's majesty and a rare moment of tranquility. But what if, instead, an unsuspecting camper found themselves capturing something so unearthly and disturbing that it would forever change how they saw those peaceful forests? Welcome to a story of unsettling echoes in the Californian wild. I'm a Los Angeles native, born and raised in Eagle Rock, though I've always considered Yosemite National Park my second home. I've taken more trips up there than I can count, mostly weekend getaways to places like Camp 4 or Upper Pines, sometimes venturing deeper into the backcountry when I'm feeling adventurous. I've heard plenty of the usual sounds one might expect out in the wilderness: bears rustling through undergrowth, the wind howling at Glacier Point, coyotes calling out under a pale moon. But in all my years, I've never heard anything like what I recorded just a few weeks ago. I was up near the Mist Trail, not too far from Vernal Fall, making my way toward the top late in the afternoon. I have this weird habit of starting hikes in the late day because I love to watch the sunset across the valley. This time, I got delayed by a bit of a jam near the steps. Some folks taking pictures, a couple of kids who slipped on the wet rock. By the time I reached the top, the light had changed to that golden hue that makes everything look surreal. I figured I'd pitch my small one-person tent somewhere close, not in an official campsite per se, but a quiet spot that I scouted on a previous trip. It wasn't exactly legal, so I won't be too specific. Let's just say it was off the beaten path enough that I had good cover among some boulders. That night, I was making dinner, a simple freeze-dried meal, when I thought I heard something echoing off the canyon walls, distant but sharp enough to catch my attention. It sounded almost like a high-pitched wail, but it ended in this guttural, throaty finish that made me freeze in place. My first instinct was maybe it was a mountain lion, but I've heard mountain lion screams before, terrifying enough in their own right, and this was different. It echoed in a way that sent chills running up my spine. I tried to brush it off as just an odd sound or maybe a weird bird call. About an hour later, it started again, only closer. I scrambled for my phone, figuring I might as well record it in case it was some unusual wildlife or something I could identify later. While I was fumbling to open my recording app, I realized that the forest had gone dead silent around me. No night insects, no rustling in the nearby bushes, nothing. That alone put me on edge. Finally, I managed to hit record just as another scream pierced the night. Listening through my headphones after the fact, I could still feel that same wave of dread. The pitch rose and then dropped like it was coming from some massive chest cavity. I can only compare it to a wolf or a coyote that's been given an amplifier, but that still doesn't quite describe the weird layered tone it had. I was shaken enough to abandon the idea of a peaceful night's sleep out there. I didn't exactly want to risk an encounter with whatever was making those noises. Maybe I should have packed up and hiked down, but that trail is treacherous in the dark, especially near the falls. So instead, I hunkered down, hoping that my tent and a good measure of caution would keep me safe until morning. I spent hours lying awake, hearing that same call, sometimes further away, sometimes echoing like it was right across the canyon. I never spotted anything, not even with my flashlight, though I was half afraid I'd see eyes reflecting back at me if I looked hard enough. Come daybreak, I practically flew down the trail, not bothering to eat breakfast. Along the way, I bumped into a couple from the Bay Area who looked startled as I passed by. In their own words, they mentioned hearing loud screeches echoing from somewhere above them in the night, and they had no idea what it was. We all had that wide-eyed look of shared confusion, and maybe fear. This made me realize I wasn't just imagining things. There truly was something screaming in those woods. Once I got back to my car near Curry Village, I tried to calm my nerves. I stopped at the village store for a cup of coffee, browsed around just to settle down. Not surprisingly, if you casually mention hearing strange calls in Yosemite, you mostly get chuckles or folks telling you it was probably a raccoon or a fisher cat. But I let a friend of mine, a fellow from Oakhurst who's been a seasonal worker, listen to my recording. His eyes went wide, and he said that he'd heard rumors from the rangers about unnatural-sounding screams near the backcountry, but they never acknowledged them publicly. Some folks blame it on cougars, others whisper about cryptid creatures or leftover legends of the Ahwanichi people who once inhabited the valley. I'm not jumping to claim it's Bigfoot or a skinwalker or anything specific. I'm just saying, if you heard the audio I captured, you'd have second thoughts about what roams the shadows of Yosemite. I tried searching online, but the best I got were theories about wendigos or unidentified forest creatures. And as skeptical as I usually am, that night made me wonder just how many corners of these national parks remain unexplored, and how many mysteries remain unsolved. Now, I still love Yosemite, but every time I remember those screams echoing off the canyon walls, I get a tight feeling in my chest. I've shared the audio with a few close friends, but I'm hesitant to post it publicly because I know the wave of skepticism and ridicule that might follow. If there's anyone else out there who's heard similar sounds or encountered something bizarre in the park, I'd be curious to know. Because I can't help but think there's more out there than just the usual wildlife, and I was unlucky, or maybe lucky, enough to catch a glimpse of it in the form of those unearthly screams. Be careful if you're camping in remote spots near the falls or anywhere off-trail. We like to think we're alone out there, but this experience taught me we might have company of a kind we're not ready to understand. And so, amid the granite domes and cascading waters of Yosemite, a camper from LA found more than just peace and quiet in the moonlit forest. Terrifying, echoing screams that defy simple explanation, echoes of something primal, or simply the cries of nature misunderstood. Sometimes our beloved parks hide secrets as old as the mountains themselves. And so, another strange encounter fades away. A trick of the mind, or something far more unsettling. That's for you to decide. Thank you so much for watching my stories. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support is what keeps this channel going.